My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm 29 years old, living in a modest apartment on the quieter side of town, where the rent doesn't swallow your entire paycheck, and the neighbors don't judge you for driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic. I'm a freelance writer, though saying that out loud always makes me feel like I'm lying, because most days I stare at a blank screen, wondering if I'll ever write anything worth reading. My family would tell you I'm the underachiever, the one who never quite figured out how to turn potential into profit, but that's a story for another day. This particular Thursday morning started like most others, with me nursing a cup of gas station coffee and scrolling through my phone, looking for inspiration that never came. Then Grandma Mabel called, her voice soft but clear through the crackling connection of her ancient landline phone that she refuses to replace despite my father's constant nagging about upgrading to something more modern. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel, sweetheart, could you drive me to the bank today? I have some paperwork to handle, and you know how I feel about taking the bus downtown. I smiled because I knew she was perfectly capable of taking the bus. Mabel Carter had been navigating this city longer than I'd been alive, but she also knew I needed an excuse to get out of my apartment and away from the cursor blinking mockingly at me from my laptop screen. Of course, Grandma. What time works for you? How about 11? That gives us both time to wake up properly. An hour later, I was pulling into the driveway of her small but immaculate house, the one she'd lived in for 43 years, where every flower in the front garden was planted with precision and the porch swing still creaked in exactly the same spot it had when I was 8 years old. She was waiting for me, dressed in her navy blue cardigan with the pearl buttons, and carrying her old leather purse that had seen more decades than most people. "You look tired, Daniel," she said as she settled into the passenger seat, adjusting her seatbelt with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to be deliberate about everything. "Just having trouble with a piece I'm working on. You know how it is." Quote. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she really understood the particular torture of staring at a blank page for hours, watching deadlines approach like storm clouds. Sometimes the best stories come when we stop trying so hard to find them. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed against the dashboard. Dad's name flashed across the screen, and I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. David Carter had a way of turning even the simplest conversations into reminders of everything I wasn't accomplishing fast enough. "Hey, Dad." "Daniel, I heard you're taking your grandmother to the bank. Make sure she doesn't get confused about anything, okay? You know how these older folks can be with numbers and paperwork. Just keep an eye on her." I glanced at Mabel, who was staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She seems fine to me, Dad. Just don't let her make any big decisions without running them by me first. I'll catch up with you both later." The line went dead, and I felt that familiar weight of being caught between loyalty to my grandmother and the exhausting task of managing my father's expectations. Mabel was still looking out the window, but I could see her reflection in the glass, and something in her eyes told me she'd heard every word. The First National Bank on Maple Street was one of those older buildings with marble floors and high ceilings that made every footstep echo like you were walking through a cathedral, and I always felt slightly underdressed whenever I walked through those heavy glass doors with their polished brass handles that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mabel moved through the space with a confidence that surprised me, nodding to the tellers behind their gleaming counters as if she'd been coming here for decades, which I realized she probably had. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," said the woman behind the customer service desk, a professional-looking Asian woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Rebecca Lynn, manager. "How can I help you today?" "Hello, Rebecca. I need to review some account information and handle a few transfers," Mabel said, her voice clear and decisive in a way that made me do a double take, because this wasn't the uncertain elderly woman my father had described on the phone just 20 minutes earlier. I found myself watching my grandmother with new eyes, noticing how she pulled out a small notebook from her purse and referenced specific account numbers, how she asked pointed questions about interest rates and processing times, how Rebecca treated her not with the patronizing patience I'd seen other people use with older customers, but with genuine professional respect. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts," Rebecca said, her fingers moving efficiently across her computer keyboard. "And you mentioned transfers. Are these between your existing accounts or to external recipients?" "Internal transfers, mostly. I want to move some funds from savings to checking, and I'd like to review my investment portfolio balance." "Investment portfolio?" I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily, because in all my 29 years, I'd never heard my grandmother mention anything about investments. And my father had always talked about her as if she was living on Social Security and maybe a small pension from her years teaching elementary school. That's when the front door chimed again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of my father's voice cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the bank like a chainsaw through silk. "Excuse me, where is Mrs. Mabel Carter? I'm her son, David Carter, and I need to speak with whoever's handling her account." I turned to see him striding across the marble floor in his expensive charcoal suit, the one he wore to important real estate closings, his leather briefcase swinging at his side, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was about to take control of a situation whether anyone wanted him to or not. Rebecca looked up from her computer screen, her professional smile flickering slightly. "Mr. Carter, your mother is right here with us. We were just—" "Mom, what are you doing?" Dad interrupted, not even acknowledging me as he positioned himself between Mabel and Rebecca's desk like a human barrier. "I told Daniel to make sure you didn't get confused about anything. You shouldn't be making financial decisions without consulting me first." The air in the bank seemed to shift, becoming heavier, more charged, and I felt my stomach clench with that familiar cocktail of embarrassment and anger that always accompanied my father's public displays of control. Mabel sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded over her small notebook, watching her son with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "David," she said quietly, "I'm perfectly capable of handling my own affairs." What happened next was something I'd never seen before in all my years of watching my father bulldoze through conversations and situations with the subtlety of a freight train, because instead of arguing or defending herself, or even looking flustered by his sudden appearance and immediate takeover attempt, Mabel simply sat there in her chair, with her hands still folded over that small notebook, watching David with the kind of calm that comes from having weathered far bigger storms than this one. "David, you're making a scene," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make Rebecca glance between them with the practiced eye of someone who'd probably witnessed more than her share of family drama played out in front of her desk. "I'm protecting your interests, Mom. You know how these financial institutions can take advantage of older customers who don't understand all the fine print and complex terms they use to confuse people." I felt heat rise in my cheeks because, even though my father wasn't directing his condescension at me, I could see how his words landed on Rebecca's face like slaps, how her professional smile tightened at the edges, and I wanted to say something, anything, to cut through the tension that was building in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. "Dad, maybe we should just let Grandma handle whatever she came here to do," I said, my voice sounding weaker than I intended, more like a suggestion than the firm statement I'd meant it to be. "Daniel, you don't understand how complicated financial matters can be for someone her age. There are regulations, investment strategies, tax implications." "Rebecca," Mabel interrupted, her voice cutting through my father's lecture with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 30 years managing a classroom full of children and knew exactly how to command attention without raising her voice. "Could you please print out my current account statement? I'd like to review my balance." David rolled his eyes in that exaggerated way he used when he thought someone was being particularly obtuse. "Mom, you don't need to waste everyone's time with paperwork. I can handle whatever questions you have about your finances." Quote. But something in the way Mabel had made her request, something in the deliberate precision of her words and the way Rebecca's expression had shifted from professional patience to something that looked almost like anticipation, made me lean forward in my chair and pay closer attention to what was about to unfold. "Of course, Mrs. Carter," Rebecca said, already moving toward the printer behind her desk. "I'll have that for you in just a moment." The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, like the moment before a magician reveals the trick that's been building throughout the entire performance. The printer hummed to life behind Rebecca's desk, and those few seconds felt like they stretched into minutes, while my father continued muttering under his breath about elderly confusion and unnecessary complications, completely oblivious to the fact that Rebecca was watching him with the kind of expression you might reserve for someone who was about to step on a rake and get smacked in the face by the handle. When Rebecca returned with the single sheet of paper, crisp and white with the bank's official letterhead. She looked directly at Mabel first, then at my father, then back at Mabel, with what I swear was the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Here you are, Mrs. Carter," she said, extending the statement toward my grandmother. But my father, true to form, reached out and plucked it from Rebecca's hand before Mabel could take it, because of course he did, because David Carter had never met a situation he couldn't improve by inserting himself into the middle of it and taking control of every moving piece. "Let me just take a look at this and explain anything that might be confusing," he said, unfolding the paper with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he already knew what he was going to find there. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I watched his face as his eyes scanned down the page, watched the exact moment when his expression shifted from patronizing certainty to confusion, then from confusion to something that looked like he'd been hit by a truck carrying a load of disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air, and he held the paper closer to his face as if proximity might somehow change the numbers printed there in stark black ink. This can't be right," he said, his voice suddenly smaller, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. I leaned over to see what had rendered my normally unflappable father speechless, and there it was, printed in simple, undeniable digits. Current balance, $12,347,892.73. $12,347,892.73. Rebecca cleared her throat gently and said in her most professional voice, "As you can see, Mrs. Carter maintains several accounts with us, including her investment portfolio, and she is indeed in full control of all her financial affairs." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents and the distant sound of traffic outside on Maple Street, while my father stared at that piece of paper like it might spontaneously combust in his hands, and I sat there feeling like everything I thought I knew about my quiet, modest grandmother had just been turned completely upside down. For the first time in what felt like years, maybe decades, my grandmother's voice rose above its usual gentle murmur, not to a shout or anything dramatic like that, but to the clear, authoritative tone I remembered from when she used to read stories to me as a child, the voice that could command attention without demanding it. "David, sit down," she said, and something in those three simple words made my father actually comply, sinking into the chair beside me like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "When your father died 8 years ago, you and Linda came to the house and told me I shouldn't be living alone, that I didn't understand how complicated finances had become, that I should let you handle my money because I was just a retired schoolteacher who wouldn't know a stock option from a savings bond." Her hands remained folded over her notebook, but her voice carried the weight of every slight, every patronizing comment, every time someone had assumed she was less capable than she actually was. "So I let you believe what you wanted to believe. I kept living in the same house, shopping with coupons, driving the same car I'd had for 15 years, because it was easier than explaining that your father and I had been investing since 1987, that we bought rental properties when the market crashed in 2008, that I understood compound interest better than most people half my age." Quote, I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word, because this was a side of my grandmother I'd never seen before, and I realized with a growing sense of shame that I'd been just as guilty as my father of underestimating her, of seeing her quiet lifestyle as evidence of limitation rather than choice. "I never needed your help, David. I was being polite when I listened to your lectures about financial responsibility and elder care. I was being kind when I didn't correct your assumptions about my capabilities." My father's face had gone through several color changes during this speech, settling finally on a pale gray that made him look like he was about to be sick. "But Mom," he stammered, "why didn't you ever say anything? Why let us think?" "Because I wanted to see how long you'd keep treating me like a child before it occurred to you to ask what I actually needed instead of telling me what you thought I needed." The power in the room had shifted so completely that even Rebecca seemed to be holding her breath, and I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. The moment when someone who'd been underestimated for years finally decided to set the record straight. The drive back to Mabel's house was the quietest 20 minutes of my life, not because we weren't talking, but because everything I thought I knew about my family, about power, about the difference between being heard and being seen, had been completely rearranged in the space of a single bank statement, and I needed time to process the fact that my modest grandmother was not only wealthier than my successful real estate broker father, but had been quietly managing a fortune while he lectured her about financial responsibility. "I'm sorry," I said finally as I pulled into her driveway, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I should have said something back there, should have stood up for you before it got to that point." Mabel was quiet for a moment, looking at her small house with its perfectly maintained garden and the porch swing that had been there since before I was born. "Daniel, sweetheart, there's more than one way to raise your voice." "What do you mean?" "Your father speaks loudly because he's afraid people won't listen otherwise. He takes control because he's terrified of not being in control. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet until the right moment, until you have something worth saying." Quote, I turned off the engine and sat there in the growing silence, thinking about all the times I'd felt inadequate compared to my father's confidence, all the moments I'd wished I could command a room the way he did, never realizing that my grandmother had been commanding rooms for decades without anyone even noticing. "How long have you been wealthy?" I asked, because I still couldn't quite wrap my mind around the numbers I'd seen on that statement. "Your grandfather and I started investing seriously in the late 80s. We bought our first rental property in 1992, then another during the recession. We were teachers, Daniel, which meant we understood the value of patience, of watching something grow slowly over time." She smiled, and for the first time I could see not just my sweet grandmother, but the shrewd investor who'd been hiding in plain sight for my entire life. "The money was never the point, though. The point was having choices, having security, having the freedom to help people when they needed it without having to ask anyone's permission." As I walked her to her front door, I realized I'd just witnessed something extraordinary, not just the revelation of hidden wealth, but a masterclass in dignity, in the power of patience, and in the difference between making noise and making an impact. 3 days later, my phone rang with my father's name on the caller ID, and I knew before I answered that this conversation was going to be his attempt to regain some kind of footing after having his entire worldview demolished in front of a bank manager and his underachieving son. "Daniel, let's grab lunch today. I want to talk to you about what happened with your grandmother." We met at Romano's, the upscale Italian place downtown where my father liked to conduct business, because the cloth napkins and expensive wine list made him feel like he was operating from a position of strength, and I could tell from the moment I walked in that he'd spent the last 3 days rebuilding his narrative about Mabel's revelation. "Look, I'll admit I was surprised by your grandmother's financial situation," he said after we'd ordered, his voice carrying that careful tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while positioning himself as the logical center of any discussion. "But you have to understand, Daniel, just because someone has money doesn't mean they know how to manage it properly." Quote, I felt something shift inside me, the same feeling I'd had watching Mabel sit calmly while he tried to take control of her life, except now his condescension was being directed not just at her, but at the very idea that she might be competent. "Dad, she's been managing it for 30 years, successfully, without any help from us. She got lucky with some investments, sure, but markets change, regulations change, tax laws change. She needs professional guidance, family oversight. Someone should be monitoring her decisions to make sure she doesn't get taken advantage of by financial advisors or scam artists." There it was, the real issue. Not concern for Mabel's well-being, but his inability to accept that she'd succeeded without him, that his role as the family's financial authority had been built on assumptions rather than reality. "What if she doesn't want oversight?" I asked, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Daniel, she's 83 years old. She might seem sharp now, but cognitive decline happens fast at that age. We have a responsibility as her family to protect her assets, to make sure her legacy is preserved for future generations." Future generations. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, and I realized what this was really about. My father wasn't worried about protecting Mabel's money. He was worried about protecting his access to it. I think, I said, setting down my fork and looking directly at him, that Grandma has earned the right to make her own decisions about her own money. A week after the bank incident, I was sitting at Mabel's kitchen table helping her organize some old photo albums when the doorbell rang, and through the front window we could see Rebecca Lynn standing on the porch with a manila envelope in her hands and that same professional smile she'd worn when she watched my father's world collapse in real time. "Mrs. Carter, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Rebecca said when Mabel opened the door. "I had some updated paperwork from your investment accounts, and I wanted to deliver it personally rather than mailing it." But I could tell from the way she glanced around the modest living room, taking in the comfortable furniture and family photos and the general atmosphere of a house where someone had lived contentedly for decades, that she was here for more than just paperwork delivery. "Would you like some tea?" Mabel asked, because that's what my grandmother did whenever anyone crossed her threshold, and within minutes we were all sitting around her small dining table with china cups and homemade cookies, while Rebecca explained the various forms and account updates with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed her work. "Mrs. Carter, I have to tell you," Rebecca said after we'd finished with the business matters, "what you did at the bank last week was remarkable. I've been in banking for 12 years, and I've seen too many elderly customers get steamrolled by family members who think they know better." Mabel stirred sugar into her tea with deliberate motions. "It wasn't remarkable, dear. It was just necessary. But it was brave. And I keep thinking about how many other people might benefit from hearing your story. From knowing that it's possible to build wealth quietly, to make smart decisions without fanfare, to maintain your independence regardless of what other people assume about your capabilities." I found myself leaning forward because Rebecca was articulating something I'd been feeling since that day at the bank, this sense that Mabel's story was bigger than just our family drama, that it represented something important about dignity and assumptions and the power of patient, deliberate choices. "I grew up with a grandmother very much like you," Rebecca continued. "She lived simply, saved wisely, and let everyone underestimate her until the day she donated $500,000 to build a new library in our town. People were shocked, but she just smiled and said she'd been waiting for the right moment to make a difference." Mabel's eyes brightened with recognition, the look of someone meeting a kindred spirit. "Maybe," Rebecca said gently, "you could consider sharing your approach with others. There are financial literacy programs, community centers, places where people would love to learn from someone who's actually lived these principles successfully." I watched my grandmother consider this suggestion, and I could practically see the wheels turning as she thought about the possibility of her quiet wisdom reaching beyond the walls of her modest house. That night, after Rebecca had left and Mabel had gone to bed, I sat at my laptop in my apartment, and for the first time in months, maybe years, the words came easily, flowing from my fingers like water that had been held back by a dam that finally gave way. I wrote about a woman who let the world underestimate her, about the difference between being quiet and being weak, about how assumptions can blind us to the extraordinary people sitting right in front of us. I called it "The Woman the World Underestimated," and I submitted it to an online magazine that specialized in human interest stories, using a pen name because I wasn't ready to have my father connect the dots between his mother's bank revelation and his son's sudden burst of creative productivity. The article went live on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday it had been shared over 50,000 times across social media platforms, with comments pouring in from people who recognized their own grandmothers, their own mothers, their own stories of being dismissed because of age or gender or quiet demeanor. "This could be my grandmother," wrote one commenter. "She lived in the same small apartment for 40 years, clipped coupons, took the bus everywhere, and after she died we found out she'd been sending anonymous scholarships to local kids for decades. My mother let my brother manage her finances for years," wrote another. "Turns out she had more money than all of us combined and was just tired of arguing about it." The responses kept coming, story after story of people who had learned too late that the quiet women in their lives had been far more capable, far more successful, far more interesting than anyone had bothered to discover while they were still around to appreciate it. When I showed Mabel the article on my phone 3 days later, watching her face as she read about herself disguised in carefully changed details and a different name, I saw something I'd never seen before: pride mixed with surprise, as if she was discovering that her story mattered to people beyond her immediate family. "You wrote this?" she asked, looking up from the screen with eyes that seemed brighter than usual. "I hope you don't mind. I changed all the names, all the specific details, but I wanted people to know that stories like yours exist, that there are extraordinary people hiding in plain sight all around us." She handed the phone back to me and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any embrace we'd shared since I was a child, and I realized that sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones we set out to tell, but the ones that find us when we're finally ready to listen. 6 months later, I found myself sitting at a folding table in the Riverside Community Center, signing copies of my first published collection, titled Hidden Strength: Stories of the Underestimated, while my grandmother stood at a small podium 20 feet away, addressing a room full of people who'd come to hear her speak about financial wisdom and the power of patient decision-making. The book had grown out of that first viral article, expanding into a collection of stories about people whose quiet competence had been overlooked by louder, more confident voices, and somehow, miraculously, people wanted to read it, wanted to share it, wanted to tell me their own stories of discovering strength in unexpected places. "The most important lesson I can share," Mabel was saying to the audience, her voice carrying clearly through the small room, "is that wealth isn't about the number in your bank account. It's about having the freedom to make choices that align with your values, and sometimes that means living below your means so you can live above your fears." I looked up from signing a book for a middle-aged woman who told me the collection reminded her of her late mother, and I saw my 8-year-old nephew Noah sitting in the front row, listening to his great-grandmother, with the kind of attention most kids his age reserved for video games and ice cream. Grandma Mabel is like a secret superhero, he'd told me earlier, and I realized he was right in ways that went far beyond her hidden fortune, because the real superpower wasn't the money, it was the way she'd maintained her dignity and autonomy while letting others reveal their own character through their assumptions about hers. That's when I noticed my father standing near the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, listening to his mother's presentation with an expression I couldn't quite read. When our eyes met across the crowded space, he walked over to my table and stood there for a moment, watching me sign another book. "I read your article," he said quietly. "I didn't know you wrote it until someone at work mentioned that the grandmother in the story sounded familiar." I waited, not sure what was coming next. "I didn't know," he said finally, and those 3 words carried more weight than any apology he might have offered. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was just protecting my own need to feel important." Quote. As we walked Mabel to my car after the event, her arms full of thank you cards from audience members and my bag heavy with empty book boxes, I realized that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about dramatic revelations or sudden transformations, but about the quiet moments when people finally see what was always there, waiting patiently to be recognized. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.